Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. Now, it's no secret that my favorite investor is Warren Buffett, and he is undoubtedly the greatest investor of all time and potentially the most quoted investor of all time as well. You really don't have to try particularly hard to go on Google, look up Warren Buffett quotes and find a seemingly endless list of results. Now, a couple of the things that I've been learning and reading recently have really brought two particular Warren Buffett quotes really to the front of my mind, and I basically want to share what those quotes are, why I think they're so insightful and so interesting, and also share what I've been reading recently and what I've learned from those couple of books. So if you enjoyed the video, please hit like and hit subscribe, but for now, let's get straight into it. So the first Buffett quote that I want to share goes something like this, and that is, "To a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail." And that is basically talking about how if you get really overly specialized in one particular area and you fail to see sort of the forest from the trees, you can really have a very limited number of tools in your mental tool belt in order to solve and analyze particular problems. And although this has, a huge application to investing, I see this in my professional career as well. I work in the agricultural industry, and let's take the example of like a struggling dairy farm. Now, what you'll have when you often see this kind of thing is you'll have all these different specialists from all these different components of the agricultural industry come in, and they'll all seem to think it is their particular specialization that, where there's really an issue and that's kind of causing the problem. Or there was all these people with only one tool in their tool belt, they've all got their hammers trying to hit this one particular nail, which might not necessarily be causing the problem. So, you'll get nutritionists in and they'll think that it's some sort of nutrient deficiency issue. You'll get a vet in, they'll think it's an animal health issue. You'll get a nutrient specialist in, they'll think it's some sort of soil fertility issue. You'll get a banker in and they'll think that the farm's just got a spending problem. And really it's unlikely to be any one particular thing that's happening in this whole farm system. And for that reason, the best farmers that we see, not only in New Zealand but around the world, tend to be generalists in a lot of ways. They tend to be pretty good at a lot of things, maybe really good at one or two things, but they really have no weaknesses when it comes to operating that entire farm system. And the book that really got me thinking about this is Range from David Epstein. Now, this is not a investing book per se, but like I say, the applications to investing and just life in general are huge in this one. So Range by David Epstein is basically sort of a rebuttal to the classic kind of 10,000 hour rule, where people say that you have to spend an ungodly amount of time to become sort of an expert in one particular skill. And it turns out that in some cases that really is true. And David Epstein does talk about a couple examples of that. So Tiger Woods being really good at golf is an example of where the 10,000 hour rule could work quite well. But it turns out that there are far more examples where being a generalist and actually specializing very late is potentially even more useful. And David Epstein goes through countless examples of that in his book Range, where having a broad set of skills really prepares you to do quite well in a lot of different fields, whereas specializing and just going deeper and deeper and deeper can often actually hold you back from kind of progressing to the next step, even down the rabbit hole that you might be working in. There's kind of countless examples throughout that book of where people have just been really stuck on a problem. Maybe they're a scientist that are heavily specialized in their field, and you need to use some kind of outside analogy from a completely unrelated field in order to solve a particular problem. And that just keeps recurring over and over and over again. And you really get to this point where David Epstein basically suggests that really any time that you're playing a sport or doing some sort of endeavor where you basically get immediate feedback on whether a particular action is a good or bad thing to have done, those are the kinds of things that you tend to be able to specialize in very early. So Tiger Woods in golf is quite a good example of that. When Tiger Woods hits a particular shot in golf, you can pretty much tell immediately whether that is a good shot or not, and you can adjust kind of accordingly. But if you take something like investing and you buy into a particular company, you really don't get immediate feedback on whether that's a good investment or not. Sure, the stock price can go up or down tomorrow, but that is really not what we're trying to achieve as investors. We're trying to get, good results over holding companies for a long period of time. So for that reason, basically generalists and people that can think very broadly are far more likely to do better at investing than people that try to specialize very early in understanding financial statements or whatever it might be about trying to understand the language of business, which I will talk about very shortly. So that's the first Buffett quote that I wanted to share. To a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Hugely applicable to many, many aspects of life, in particular investing. Okay, so the second Warren Buffett quote that I wanted to share in this video is that accounting is the language of business. And accounting for a lot of people is something that sounds particularly boring, and it is sort of a necessary skill though in order to understand investment. So contrary to what I was talking about at the start of this video, accounting is one of those aspects where there really is kind of like a set way of doing things, and sure, accounting rules can change and adapt over time, but really it is something you just have to understand as an investor. And for a few years now, I felt like I've had a pretty reasonable understanding of accounting, but just in the last week or so, I sat down and got through a book with the thrilling title, Warren Buffett and the Interpretation of Financial Statements, and it was actually surprisingly helpful. It's quite a simple and short, kind of easy read. Basically goes through pretty much every line on a financial statement, so if you're not into this stuff, you're probably not going to enjoy it, but it is something that I think is kind of a necessary evil, and it's actually also put in kind of a Warren Buffett context. So it really tries to frame each part of a financial statement to help you assess whether or not a business has a particular competitive advantage. So does it have a high gross profit? Is it spending a lot of money on capital expenditures? Is it buying back shares or paying dividends? Is it taking on unnecessary debt? How does minority ownership factor into financial statements and the economics of a business? These are all things that actually can be quite dynamic, but are all described within the aspects of the three financial statements: the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow. So this is that book, Warren Buffett and the Interpretation of Financial Statements. It's written by Mary Buffett and David Clark. Now, Mary Buffett is actually a former, I think, daughter-in-law of Warren Buffett. Unsure whether that relationship actually provided any insights on accounting, but they did put together a pretty good book, which is a nice, easy read. Now, I will say, if you actually are going to buy the physical book, you might see some reviews on Amazon that say something about it having some like funky pages that are like really weirdly cut kind of down the edges. That is true. I don't know what's going on there, but just a small side note if you do end up purchasing this book. Now, this is kind of an interesting contrast to range, which I just talked about earlier. Like I say, accounting is one of those things that you kind of either get it right or wrong, and it is something where a bit of specialization from time to time definitely helps. But having had the background of trying to understand different businesses in the past, I found that, I guess, specializing a little bit later in terms of trying to learn the ins and outs of accounting has made things really, really easy for me to wrap my head around. Now, if I had never had any experience in business or investing in my entire life and tried to sit down and read a book on accounting, I think you would really struggle to frame a lot of the ideas. You really wouldn't have those practical examples that you could pull into your head about, okay, what is a cost of goods sold, or what is a capital expenditure, and how is that depreciated on an income statement, and all that kind of stuff. I think it could get maybe a little bit too academic if you didn't have that practical kind of background in terms of understanding real businesses that might already be in my portfolio, or that I might work in on a daily basis, or whatever it might be. So there you have it. Those are a couple of my favorite Warren Buffett quotes, and just a couple that I've been really thinking about lately. To a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Of course, inspired by Range by David Epstein. This, I honestly cannot describe how many times that quote popped into my head. It must have been coming into my head like every 5 or 10 pages as I was reading this thing. It's just incredibly applicable to that particular statement by Warren Buffett. And of course, accounting is the language of business, and if you're going to be an investor over a long period of time, as much as you want to think broadly, you do have to have some of those specific skills in the tool belt. You do still need a hammer every now and then to whack in those nails. So those are a couple of book recommendations and a few ideas I've been thinking about recently. So I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please hit like and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.
Right. Yeah, the data's there.
In business school?
Sure, and the data's there. So they focus on whether if you buy stocks on Tuesday and sell them on Friday, you're better off, or if you buy them in election years and sell them in other years, you're better off, or if you buy small companies. There are all these variables because the data are there, and they've learned how to manipulate data. And as a friend of mine says, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And once you have these skills, you just are dying to utilize them in some way, but they aren't important. If I were being asked to participate in a business opportunity, would it make any difference to me whether I bought it on a Tuesday or a Saturday or an election year or something? It's not what a businessman thinks about in buying businesses. So why think about it when buying stocks? Because stocks are just pieces of businesses. more important. People ask me what they should take in business school, or even if they don't go to business school, what they need to know before getting in business. And I tell them, you have to understand accounting. It's the language. I mean, it's like being in a foreign country without knowing the language if you're in business and you don't understand accounting. So you want to get as comfortable with that as you are with the English language. It's made me a lot of money because I listened to what Ray Dean had to say 53 or 4 years ago, and have been able to understand what I was seeing on pieces of paper, what that told me about businesses, and the limitations of what it told me about businesses. I mean, but that's the way we invest.